I wanted to break down another one of my counters to Force Wave 1139. That was in his article. In his article from 2019, full link to the teardown of the article in the description, he claims that the only thing canon to Lucas besides the movies was TCW. However, he only brings up one, and only one cherry-picked quote from George Lucas to try and prove his point. The other pieces of evidence he uses are second-hand, also cherry-picked sources from Dave Filoni, Pablo Hidalgo, and Leland Chee. So it's funny how Force Wave claims any of the quotes me and other EU fans use to try and defend our points don't count because they're just lesser second-hand sources or just the opinion of Lucas licensing, when he is doing the exact same thing and using what would count as that too, under his reasoning and logic to defend his points. Since Starlog Quote Humpers only think George Lucas's words are the word of law that count and outrank anything else said by other people at Lucasfilm, I want to bring up other things the big man George himself has directly said about TCW that Force Wave left out. And I brought up some of these quotes in the Force Wave video. And of course Force Wave just ignored them because they don't agree with his agenda. How convenient. I also want to show that if people believe the Starlog quote and the Cinescape quote as the only definitive sources from George Lucas that prove whether or not the Star Wars EU is canon, then they have to give the exact same treatment to TCW, which would mean that from 1977 to 2014, the only things that were ever canon in Star Wars were the 6 Star Wars films and nothing else ever was. Before I get into all this, I want to make a disclaimer and clarify something, before I go on. I don't actually believe this. TCW and the expanded universe were definitely canon before 2014. That's undisputable. And I don't actually believe George is saying that TCW is not canon in any of the quotes I'm going to bring up. Just like he isn't saying the expanded universe is not canon in the cherry-picked Starlog and Cinescape quote. I'm simply bringing these quotes up to show that if they believe Starlog or Cinescape and believe he's saying the EU isn't canon in them, then they have to hold TCW to the same standards, since George Lucas uses similar language like he does in those 2 quotes. So let's get to my main points. The only quote directly from George Lucas Force Wave brings up to try and defend his point about TCW is one specific thing George said on SciFiNow.com in 2011, where he said the following: "This is Star Wars, and I don't make a distinction between the Clone Wars series and the films." While this one specific quote Force Wave uses could be used to try and prove his point, Lucas does not specify in what way or how he doesn't make a distinction between the two. He doesn't say the word canon, and well, he could be saying canon, or he could also be referring to tone, style, aesthetic, etc. It isn't clear, so trying to use this quote doesn't quite prove it. Since Force Wave only cherry-picked one quote from George Lucas regarding TCW to try and prove his faulty narrative, what are some of the other statements from George Lucas he left out or did no further research on? Let's take a look at one of the George Lucas quotes I brought up in my Force Wave response. This was a quote that Force Wave had no response back to and ignored it because it didn't agree with his agenda when I brought it up. This is from MTV.com in 2008, where Lucas says, "TCW is not a Skywalker story. In the end, the movie, and by extension, the 100-episode TV show for which it serves as a prologue, is not a Skywalker story," Lucas insisted. "The epic itself is basically about one man. He passed through a lot of things, but you never get to look at it. With Clone Wars, we're not burdened by the mythological underpinnings. We get to go more places," Lucas said. "The story about Anakin Skywalker and his fall to the dark side and redemption by his son. That's finished. It started when he was 10, it ends when he died. There's no more story to tell. All that stuff is really not part of what this is. Stylistically and tonally, however, the film almost takes place an entirely separate universe. Here, Lucas says that TCW is not a Skywalker story, and all that stuff is not part of what TCW is. He also says that they aren't burdened or limited by the mythological underpinnings of the movies. The next quote here is from EW.com in 2008. Where is the live-action one going to fit into the overall Star Wars narrative? It's completely separate. This one has all the characters that everybody knows. Everybody from Yoda to Anakin to Mace Windu to Obi-Wan. Everybody's there. A live-action has nobody there because it's after Episode 3, so everybody's dead. Basically, or hiding somewhere. You hear about the Emperor just like you do in Episode 4, but it's mostly about a whole different world. I mean, there are a million stories in the big city. You've only seen one of them. Now this one is a bit tricky. George is asked about the live-action series. Star Wars Underworld, I presume? But then he randomly brings up TCW? Nothing to do with the question he was asked, really. But remember, if Underworld had been made, it would have been T-canon just as TCW was. If George describes Underworld as being completely separate from the overall Star Wars narrative when asked, similar to what he said about TCW, again, which was also T-canon, that says a lot about both TCW and Underworld. Both would not be on the same level as the films. This next quote is from Starlog magazine number 370. What do you know? A quote from Starlog magazine of all sources. The Clone Wars is like a footnote to the live-action features. The features are Anakin Skywalker's story. So when you go between Episode 2 and Episode 3, it's like there's a little asterisk that says, more about the Clone Wars, the animated series. But it doesn't really have anything to do with Anakin's story. About his fall to the dark side. In the animated series, Anakin is simply a normal person. It's consistent with the live-action films, but in the movies you never see Anakin as a normal person. He's always struggling. So this gives us a chance to broaden and show that Anakin was a regular guy just as he was in Episode 1. While George Lucas does say it is consistent with the live-action films, much like the quote Force Wave cherry-picked as his only source from George Lucas on TCW for use in his article, George does not specify in what way it is consistent with it. Doesn't specifically say the word canon at all, and again, could be referring to many broad things. It is also interesting when Lucas says that Anakin from TCW is consistent with the films, when if you've watched TCW, Anakin Skywalker is very, very different personality-wise. It feels like he is a completely different character from what we see in the movies sometimes. George Lucas reiterates here, much like he did in the MTV.com interview, in that TCW has nothing to do with Anakin's story or his fall to the dark side. George even describes it as being a footnote to the movies. Just what is a footnote? There are several definitions of what a footnote is. Number one, a note at the bottom of the page that gives more detailed information about something on the page. A footnote is also described as the following as well. An additional fact, event, or comment that is not very important. Given the word that George Lucas uses about TCW not really having anything to do with Anakin's story of his fall, it seems the second definition of the word footnote would be the one that applies here, with TCW being some additional stuff, but not really being that important to the bigger picture itself, his story or his fall. As I elaborated at the start, Force Wave and the other Starlog Quote Humpers insist and believe that George Lucas's word outranks the word of anything his subordinates at Lucasfilm say. They insist the quotes me and other people use to defend the canonicity of the Star Wars expanded universe prior to 2014 are lesser and secondhand sources, so they don't count. By that logic of George Lucas's words being more important than anyone else's, the cherry-picked, second-hand, lesser sources Force Wave used from Dave Filoni, Pablo Hidalgo, and Leland Chee do not count either, as what Lucas said here outranks them. Speaking of the Filoni, Hidalgo, and Chee quotes that were cherry-picked, I could end the video here since my main point has been elaborated on, but I want to continue to just show how poorly researched the Force Wave article is even further. Force Wave cherry-picks those specific quotes, but the lesser second-hand information he brings up has been contradicted by other statements from many of the same people. In the exact same Reader's Companion Force Wave cherry-picked from, Pablo Hidalgo later contradicts himself and stated that the 501st Legion was first made canon in Star Wars when they appeared in the EU novel Survivor's Quest. Survivor's Quest was the first official Star Wars work to use the 501st Legion name. The 501st began in 1997 as a fan organization of stormtrooper and Imperial costumers, and has been a mainstay at Star Wars, sci-fi, and comic book conventions. Members are lauded by Lucasfilm for their charitable work, particularly with children's hospitals. Author Timothy Zahn had met fans from the 501st on many book tours and convention appearances, and honored them by including them as part of the Star Wars canon. Dave Filoni has said many things that contradict what Force Wave has brought up here in the past as well. I've seen this quote be passed around by Starlog Quote Humper Grim on the Dark Side when he goes around on any internet platform he can possibly find to spam dozens upon dozens of quotes, as well as a few other people I know have also used this quote too. When Grim and these others I know posted it, they never list a source for this one, so I'll bring it up anyways. Filoni claims that TCW is a cannon bomb. When making Clone Wars, I always knew we were doing the cannon bomb, or the continuity bomb, and I'd go into the office and be like, wait until you hear what the Mandalorians are like to George. And I would know a year or more in advance what that was going to do. But to be honest, I still work the same way I did when I worked with George, which is, there's an amazing group of talented artists and writers creating all of this stuff, and I still mine it all the time. If the EU was never canon, then how can TCW be a cannon bomb on canon if it was never canon in the first place? Like I said, I've seen people share this quote and post it around, but there is never a listed source for where it originated from. If anyone watching knows where Filoni mentioned TCW being a canon bomb on the expanded universe, please let me know in the comments section. In Star Wars Insider issue 115, Dave Filoni talks about the TCW Mandalorians and how all the history and lore about the Mandalorians as presented in KOTOR is still there. He also states the other EU stuff is not necessarily eliminated or gone. Did you draw on any expanded universe sources when you were developing them for the show? Not particularly. There were only a few scant things that George and I actually used in the Clone Wars series itself. That's not to say that the other EU stuff is eliminated or gone. I know some people will say this isn't the way I pictured it, but we're showing a particular point of their history, which is a very interesting development point. When I play games like Knights of the Old Republic that have Mandalorians in them, all of that history is still there. We're just looking at one slice of it at this particular moment. It's bound to be different from some people's ideas. If the EU was never canon, like Filoni later claims in the quotes Force Wave brings up, why does he claim that the other EU stories aren't eliminated or made gone? And that the history from KOTOR is all still there? Answer me that. Filoni also mentions that the Kyber Crystal Cave in the Gathering episode of TCW has lore and continuity ties to the SWTOR MMO in Star Wars Insider 140. I did some research to figure out what the Crystal Caves would look like, too, to give it a sense of history. I put nice little clues in there for people playing the Old Republic MMO to see some connectivity between the game and the history we created. You can see their fleet symbol on the Crucible ship. Why does and what's the point of Filoni creating connectivity between the SWTOR MMO and TCW if SWTOR had never been canon? But it really doesn't matter in the end, because these quotes and the ones brought up by Forcewave from the same people are just Lucasfilm's opinion and a lesser second-hand source, if you go by the own logic of the Starlog Quote Humpers like Logan or Forcewave. So in the end, if the Starlog Quote Humpers such as Forcewave interpret the Starlog and Cinescape sources from Lucas as him saying the expanded universe was not canon, By that standard, they also have to give TCW the exact same treatment, since Lucas calls TCW separate from Anakin Skywalker's story several times, as I've shown here. So in the end, I guess the only things canon to Star Wars have only ever been the 6 films, and only that. Of course, I don't actually believe that. TCW was certainly canon before 2014. George is just saying TCW is not on the same level of canon as his films, much like that's what he's actually saying in the Hump to Death Starlog quote and the Cinescape quote too. And of course, in the hierarchy of canon system, TCW was listed below the films, just like the EU was. Nothing about anything being non-canon is being said in any of those quotes. George has never used the word canon whenever he talked about the franchise, ever. I just brought up the quotes to go by the standards and logic of these people who believe George Lucas is the only definitive source of information, and anything he says outranks anything his company says, which would mean the quotes Forcewave brought up to try and defend his points, other than just the one measly quote he used, are just Lucasfilm, Chi, Dave, and Pablo's opinions, and lesser secondhand sources, and use this logic against them to destroy their narrative, as well as show how little to no poor cherry-picking research these people tend to do. Let's see what mental gymnastics these Starlog Quote Humpers go through to deny or rationalize the George Lucas quotes I brought up here, like Forcewave already did when I brought up the MTV.com quote, since these people tend to blatantly ignore any information that does not fit their beliefs or narrative. The very definition of cognitive dissonance. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed the little breakdown and expansion of points from my main video, and I'll see you in the next video.